Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first tech debate on emerging technologies. My name is Michael Hoffman. I'm one of the directors of the Center for Ethics and Technology, and we are arranging these tech debates in order to stimulate discussion and debate on emerging technologies as long as they are still in their infancy. The current tech debate today will focus on lethal autonomous robots. Lethal autonomous robots, or LARs for short, are machines that can decide to take human lives. Such a technology might have revolutionary implications for the battlefield and beyond. Opponents call LARs killer robots because they are deadly or lethal. They are autonomous because they can select and engage targets without further intervention by human operators. LARs decide on their own what to do based on the data they process on the battlefield and based on the algorithms that guide their behavior. For our debate on LARs, it is important to get a better understanding of what autonomy exactly means. The word has two components, auto and nomos. Both are Greek, nomos meaning laws and rule, and auto, self. So autonomous basically means a self-governing system, and in the application of machines, you could say any machine is autonomous that initiates certain actions without a direct human intervention. Military experts envision machines with autonomy for a wide range of applications. They talk about autonomy as a continuum with significant human intervention on one side, like in drones, which are still remotely controlled when it comes to firing, and full autonomy, as in lethal autonomous robots on the other side of the spectrum. Weapon systems might have several autonomous components. A drone, for example, might be able to start and land autonomously while the firing is controlled by a human being. In the United States, military experts warn of misleading images of computers making independent decisions or uncontrolled actions. A recent report of a task force of the Department of Defense on autonomy and defense systems stresses 2 points against this image. The first one is that all autonomous systems are supervised at some level at least, and second, that the software guiding the behavior of these robots imposes limits on the actions and decisions delegated to a machine. One particular set of those limits has been proposed by Arkin, one of our guests tonight. He designed what he calls an ethical governor for LARs. The ethical governor is intended to constrain the behavior of LARs. In his book, Governing Lethal Behavior in Autonomous Robots, Arkin writes, I quote, "If a LAR encounters any situation outside of those covered by a set of predefined ethical constraints, it cannot be permitted to issue a lethal response." Quote, end of quotation. These ethical constraints are derived from and span the laws of war and rules of engagement as they are formulated in international agreements. The set of ethical constraints, to quote Ron Arkin again, defines the space where lethality constitutes a valid and permissible response by the system, end of quotation. The laws of war require, for example, the protection of civilians or Red Cross personnel and of soldiers who surrender. These laws of war are based on international treaties like the Geneva Conventions. Each nation that signed these treaties is obligated to follow these laws of war, and that means LARs can only be deployed in the battlefield by those nations if they can guarantee that these robots act according to the laws of war. But that alone does not answer the question whether it's ethical to develop LARs and to deploy them in the battlefield when they are developed. This brings us to the core of our debate tonight. Can lethal autonomous robots ever be justified from an ethical point of view? If they can, what conditions and rules must be followed? If they cannot, what does that mean for ongoing research and development? These are the questions that should be debated and discussed. The event today is part of this discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. I welcome especially our two debaters, Ron Arkin and Rob Sparrow. Ron is here with me in the room. He is a professor of robotics at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and Rob is over there in Australia, connected via internet. He is a philosophy professor at Monash University and one of the founding members of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. Before we start the debate, with some introductory remarks, first by Ron and then by Rob, I would like to use the opportunity to invite you all to continue the debate online in the collaborative argument and debate visualization software AGORA-net. Simply go to agora.gartech.edu, go then to technology assessment and click on lethal autonomous robots, and then you can create arguments or you can participate in debates. Okay, let me now switch over to Ron and ask him for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Michael. And it's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you, Rob, for agreeing to debate and discuss this pressing topic today. The real question in front of us is, what about non-combatants? The current status with respect to non-combatants is utterly unacceptable. Too many innocent people are being killed in modern warfare and in ancient warfare by virtue of human action. So the question I pose is, how do we address the plight of the non-combatant? We cannot ignore this. Military robotics historically has addressed the issue of winning wars. It has not focused on how we can reduce non-combatant casualties. I would contend that actually Rob and I have much in common. His concerns arise from the potential damage he feels from his perspective that can result from the unrestrained use of, to use his language, killer robots. I feel that's an unfair term, but that's a separate issue. That is his language. I actually will posit that we can potentially reduce civilian casualties through the use of this technology, just as we do with precision-guided munitions, if, and it's a big if the technology is developed carefully. And only under those circumstances should it be released into the battle space. One thing I must make clear is we are not using a philosopher's definition for autonomy here. These robots are not sentient. They will not be sentient anytime in the foreseeable future. They will not have free will. They will not have moral agency. This eliminates the question regarding responsibility, which will always vest in a human being. Autonomy from a roboticist perspective and from the military's perspective is the ability to designate and engage a target when so tasked by a human being, just as a commanding officer would task a particular soldier to engage that particular target. I need to state, I am not a proponent for lethal autonomous robots. I don't believe in killing anything, okay? The real question is, and if you factor this down into just war theory with the use ad bellum arguments about thresholds of entry into war, which will make an interesting discussion later, to those discussions that are use in bello, where we are concerned with how you fight the war morally or ethically according to international law, how can we, if we are in a war, ensure that these systems behave appropriately? And I'll talk about a couple of assumptions in my work in a bit. I am not averse to a ban. I have said that in my writings. If an outright ban is an appropriate decision and is considered for whatever reasons, whether they be deontological, rights-based for respect of the required right for a human not to be killed by a machine, although humans have been killed and are continuing to be killed by machines in a continual way, and some can be defined as autonomous. But if that's what society says, I'm perfectly happy with that. Part of the reason that drew me into this discussion is I've been involved in the development of autonomy for over 25 years. I have to bear some of the responsibility for the advent of this technology, and as such, it needs to be used responsibly. But I also believe, I do believe, given the condition of warfighters in modern war, that there is a propensity for a certain number of warfighters to potentially violate, not potentially, to violate the laws of war and commit atrocities. Atrocity is an inherent human behavior, one that does not have to be replicated in a robotic system. And what I argue for, and have successfully helped influence, is that for a moratorium as opposed to an outright ban. We need to take the time to think about what we're defining, what we're banning, how we're going to characterize these systems. We need to be able to determine, can research ultimately reduce human casualties in the battle space? To me, that's a consequentialist argument. If we can save lives through the use of this technology, just as precision-guided munitions are mandated by Human Rights Watch, which have come out against lethal robotic systems, or killer robots, if I use their language, if we can show that if these systems are in the armamentarium and they can provably, and I say they have to be provably show that they can reduce human casualties, particularly regarding innocents in the battle space, that there is a moral imperative for them to be used, if we can achieve that. And notice, this is a research hypothesis. It is not a definitive statement. And I am optimistic that this level of performance can be achieved for two reasons. One is the rapid advent of the technology in many ways. Machines are getting smarter and stronger and in many ways more capable than human beings currently are. And if you look at human performance in the battlefield, that is a relatively low bar. I have the utmost respect for our young men and women in the battlefield. But we are putting human beings into conditions where they are assured to fail, a significant percentage of them. Can we design robotic platforms ultimately that can achieve this particular goal? I believe yes. But until we can, we have to be circumspect about how we move forward. And that requires a pause. We need to be able to investigate whether or not this is a potential feasible solution. And that's not to say it's easy. It is extremely hard. But it was hard to go to the moon. It was hard to go to build submarines and all this kinds of technology. It was hard to have Watson. All these systems that we see. Hard to build a Google autonomous car. And actually, Google does this for the very same reason, by the way. They argue that human drivers are the most dangerous thing on the road. So if you want to save lives, we've got to get people out of cars and have robots driving them. As well. So this is an important aspect. So I argue that it's more appropriate to have a moratorium to sort out the definitions, to better address the plight of non-combatants, and determine also, is existing international humanitarian law inadequate? Do we have to add something? Are we doing that out of pure pathos or fear? Are we always invoking the image of the Terminator and the killer robots as the basis for making rational decision-making in this case? I would contend that is something that is often used by my NGO counterparts from time to time. So the debate here is not about whether or not we should have wars. The real question is, assuming wars will continue, and unfortunately I think that's a reasonable assumption, what is the appropriate role of technology? The military wants this research. Militaries, not just the U.S., but nations all across the world, 40, 50, 60, 70, depending upon how you count. They use them for force multiplication, being able to have one soldier do the work of many. They use it to fight over larger battle spaces, bigger areas. They use it to extend the warfighter's reach, to be able to send something around a corner or over a hill before they actually engage that target and lower risk to the warfighters with an effort to win wars and reduce friendly casualties. But there has been little to none, other than some of the work that I will take credit for, in terms of addressing how can we reduce non-combatant casualties. This brings a plethora of issues with it. Rob will talk about some of them, no doubt, in the time to come. And what's interesting also, recently, Human Rights Watch, which I believe is an outgrowth of ICRAC's work, which Rob is a founding member of, the International Committee of Robot Arms Control, has come out with a call for a ban, along with Article 36 and many other NGOs trying to establish that in November of 2012. Shortly thereafter, 2 days thereafter, coincidentally, the U.S. Department of Defense mandated restrictions on the development of these things in what I call a quasi-moratorium, where certain classes of these systems are not to be deployed for at least 10 years, and in 5 years we'll revisit whether 10 years is soon enough. And the UN Human Rights Council, the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, Christoph Haynes, argued and successfully for a call for a moratorium. I was part of the expert panel on which that deliberations were considered, as were Steve Goose, head of Human Rights Watch, and Noel Sharkey, another founding member of International Committee of Robot Arms Control. These are important things. The world is changing around us. People are correctly saying we need to examine this. We cannot blindly go forward. So I asked the rhetorical question, should soldiers be robots? Isn't that largely what they're trained to be? Isn't that how we try to dehumanize our warriors to be able to kill in the first place? Killing is not a natural thing. And secondly, should robots be soldiers? The underlying thesis is, could they be more humane than human warfighters? The propensity for humans to stray outside the bounds of international humanitarian law is well documented. No better place than the Surgeon General's report from Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2006, excuse me. There's data on that which I don't have time to present, but there are many reasons why I believe this is the case, and maybe in the questions I'll talk about why I believe robots can potentially satisfy this criteria better than human beings. So I asked my colleagues, certainly, is it not our responsibility as scientists to look for effective ways to reduce man's inhumanity to man through technology? Should we just allow the status quo in Syria and everywhere else to continue the way it is? That is unacceptable to me. I cannot turn my back on the slaughter that is going on of innocent non-combatants. And I do believe technology can play a role. And what better place at the so-called tip of the spear where the killing is actually occurring at this point? That is my position on that, and I do believe that research in military ethical robots can and should be applied toward that end. And I'll leave you with this, since I know I'm short on time. My underlying research thesis, and keep in mind that this is a thesis, and this is not a short-term research agenda, and it requires a substantial research effort, not by me, but by a whole community to potentially address, that robots can ultimately be more humane than human beings in military situations. They will never be perfectly ethical. They will make mistakes. But if they make fewer mistakes than human warfighters do, that translates into the saving of non-combatant lives. And that is both a deontological win, the right to life is being protected, and a consequentialist win, in the sense we have lost fewer innocent lives in the process. To me, that's important.
Thank you very much, Ron. Rob, would you like to react to that with your introductory statement, please?
So thank you, Michael, and thanks for the invitation to debate here, to Ron for participating in the debate, and also to the audiovisual crew that's made my participation from Australia possible. I think I'll begin with three cautionary remarks about the debate about lethal autonomous robots or killer robots. Despite Ron's sort of virtuous motivations, and Ron's made a very eloquent presentation about his concerns for non-combatants, there's a clear sense in which every dollar, every hour of an engineer's time spent on developing autonomous weapons represents a tragic failure of the human capacity to imagine or realise a world in which peace is secured through justice, rather than the threat of armed force, and rather than the threat of a missile or a bomb from a hovering robot overhead. The amount of money that people are spending today on military research is frankly obscene, particularly in the context of the other threats facing human beings. And given the fact that people like myself and wealthy people in the United States have never been more secure in human history. There's never been a society that is more secure from external threat than the United States. So to be thinking now, how can we improve our weaponry, and investing this enormous amount of money in military research is a tragedy. So even despite Ron's virtuous motivations, if he wins this debate, I think in some sense that will be a tragedy. I also want to warn against the dangers of US exceptionalism, of thinking that it's always going to be us who have the autonomous weapons and that we will never become potential targets. This seems to me to be very much a part of the way the debate about drones has proceeded. And because the United States has such a staggering technical lead in this area of technology, it's easy to forget that other nations will catch up, and that the very fact that the US is investing so heavily in this technology means that other nations will also invest. So when we're thinking about killer robots, what we need to be thinking about is a situation in which US servicemen and women are being hunted and killed by robots. And indeed, we need to think about a circumstance in which we might be in the robots' crosshairs. We should be thinking about a situation in which perhaps autonomous Chinese submarines are loitering off the coast of the United States, ready to fire missiles if some certain set of conditions are met. And now, of course, if Ron's right, and these weapons will in fact kill fewer non-combatants, then maybe we should be entirely happy about that circumstance. But I do want people to keep in mind that this is not just about how we should kill them, but it's about how they should kill us in the future. Now, despite Ron's remarks about that these weapons will never be sentient or autonomous in the moral sense of the word, I do want to flag the fact that autonomy is a slippery concept, and that a lot of what is going on in the current debate is that people are moving from claims about the capacities of autonomous weapons that actually seem to require something close to a moral sense in the robot. And then back again to the idea that these are just complex fire and forget systems. And so what I would ask you to keep in mind is it realistic to expect a weapon to be capable of making the sorts of discriminations that Ron claims for it, without, in some sense, becoming an artificial agent, without us feeling as though we need to attribute responsibility to the weapon. Now, of course, we can always just assign responsibility to the commanding officer. We can say, yes, there's a human supervising, but as Michael's introductory remarks made clear, autonomous weapons, by definition, the weapon is making the decision. The human may have set the parameters, may have decided to launch the weapon, but it's the robot that is doing the killing. And so we need to keep in mind, we need to be quite careful in talking about autonomy here. So with those sort of notes of caution, let me just briefly go through my reasons for being concerned about a future in which autonomous weapons are widely deployed. I am cynical about our capacity to realise the sort of the research hypothesis that Ron has put forward. I think that the problem of getting machines to recognise the application of the laws of war is profoundly difficult. It involves very, very difficult issues in sensing technology, being able to recognise combatants reliably, remembering that not every person carrying a gun is a combatant, remembering that there might be neutral parties on the battlefield. It involves recognising civilians who are carrying golf clubs, and so that might look as though they're carrying a weapon. There's the complexity of that task is really unimaginably high. If we start to think about the proportionality calculations that are required in licensing an attack on a military target, in order to attack a military target, one needs to be able to have a reasonable expectation that only a certain number of non-combatants' lives will be placed at risk through that attack. And that's a very context-specific and sensitive calculation. And I'm cynical about the capacity of machines to perform those calculations for the foreseeable future. Now, of course, that's an empirical matter, may well be proved wrong on that, but we want to be a little bit tempered in our enthusiasm for robotic weapons once we realise just how hard that task is. I do want to insist that whatever machines are doing, and if they are less than full AIs, when they are avoiding causing non-combatant casualties, they won't be doing ethics. It's a mistake to talk of these as ethical machines. These machines, they may have ethical parameters or parameters that were guided by ethical considerations built into them, but the machine itself will not be reasoning ethically. It won't be doing ethics. And the mere fact that a machine is more accurate than a human competitor falls well short of establishing that it's ethical. And this is this question about whether where we set the bars for an ethical weapon, where we set the bar for an ethical weapon. If you are a consequentialist, you might simply say, look, my robot kills fewer non-combatants than your human troops. I take it that's Ron's goal, to get a robot that will kill fewer non-combatants than a human being. But let me put it this way. Say I'm a member of a rather sort of reckless team of combat soldiers, and my comrades kill 3 civilians for every legitimate target through reckless disregard. They're not very well trained, or they're not abiding by their training, and they're killing 3 civilians through reckless disregard. I only kill 2 civilians through reckless disregard. And I say, look, I'm an ethical soldier. That's not enough. What we expect of a human being in that context is that they don't display a reckless disregard for human life. And so I think that putting a weapon into action, knowing that it will in fact risk a certain number of non-combatant lives, and indeed it's incapable of, it's illegitimate of us to expect perfection. We can expect perfection of human beings. We may not get it, but the ethical demands in relation to innocent human lives are very strong. We should not be killing non-combatants outside of the laws of war. So we can expect perfection. We may not get it of human beings, but I don't think we can do that of these robots if we're merely basing our claim that they're ethical on the grounds of a sort of statistical calculation. I do think that there is a right not to be killed by a robot. I think that it's profoundly disrespectful of our enemy to say, you're like vermin, we're going to set mousetraps for you. We've got a loitering robot, and whether you live or die is not worth a moment of a human's time. I think that's a problem that goes deep to the notion of robotic weapons. And finally, I actually think these weapons, and I'm pressed for time, so I'll close quickly here. I think these weapons will clearly make war more likely. They'll make it easier for governments to go to war. They'll lower the threshold of conflict because there'll be no danger of our troops being killed. And indeed, that war will be invisible to the public when it's carried out by robotic weapons. And I think in the future there'll be a very real risk of accidental war, a war triggered by the actions of robotic weapons. So for those reasons, I think even a weapon that was in fact more discriminating, the sort of weapon that Ron is imagining will actually lead to more civilian casualties. That a weapon that is indeed more precise makes it more attractive to go to war, and so the long-term result is actually more innocent human lives are lost. So for those reasons, I do indeed think that we should be working towards a ban on lethal autonomous weapons.
Thank you, Rob. Ron, I would like to ask you to react to Rob's statement and to tell us what you think about his main points.
Sure. Thank you, Rob, for sharing your points of view, which I already knew, but it's good to say them in front of an audience. Regarding U.S. exceptionalism, that's really not the case, at least from the military's point of view. I was just at an Army meeting last week, and one of the issues that came up, again, was the development of these particular types of systems, and how are we going to, as a nation, manage the new threats that are posed by major powers such as China. Iran just today announced a weaponized drone. It's extended its capability from 24 hours aloft to 30 hours aloft. So this country, at least from the military's perspective, is not naive about the threats that are being posed. Secondly, regarding the issues of ethical reasoning, these systems do not have to have or anywhere come close to realizing full human moral reasoning. That is impossible. That is outside of the bounds anytime soon of these particular capacities. What I have argued for and will continue to argue for is the notion of bounded morality, that these systems must be used in very narrow, specific circumstances, just in the ways in which we use dogs or other resources for particular kinds of tasks where they have been certified and qualified for, and not to carry the illusion, which no one in the military is, that we are creating replacements for human warfighters with full moral faculties and full deep ethical reasoning. They are intended to comply with the laws of war, which every weapon system that is developed now must be shown to do in any case. Thirdly, the notion of we have a fundamental human right not to be killed by a robot. Is there a fundamental human right not to be killed by an artillery shell? Is there a fundamental human right not to be killed by a cruise missile, which in fact is a robotic platform? What is the fundamental human right that is so special about this particular kind of technology? These systems have been tasked by human beings. These systems are ultimately answerable to the human beings who have either developed, deployed, created, or tasked them to carry out these particular actions. A human is responsible for their actions. The terminology question that you brought up, whether they're ethical or not, to me is beside the point. If you don't like the term, don't use it. I won't use it if it makes you happier. The real question is, can the ethical requirements as determined by the laws of war be met? If you don't want to call a robot that satisfies those requirements ethical, then don't call it an ethical robot. It's not relevant to the actual argument that I'm trying to make here. And finally, proportionality. By the way, there are already in existence proportionality aids for humans, which are computerized. It was initially called bug splat, which is a very injudicious term, but they do these computations to assist human warfighters. Right now, most of the proportionality calculations are seat-of-the-pants type operations, which come through experience and mistakes through the use, either under use of force or over use of force. I do believe that with faster than real-time simulations and the use of structures and analysis on that, we can do better. So proportionality is the case. And finally, regarding the threshold of conflict, yes, I do believe that this technology, as well as any other military technology which creates an asymmetric advantage, can potentially lead to adventurism or destabilization. But it is not just LARs. It is not just lethal autonomous robots. It's cyber warfare. It's human augmentation. It's any of these new technologies that I suspect your group will talk about in the debates to come. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to basically put an end, as I think you want, based on your dollar arguments from the beginning, to research in military technology. Well, that, in one sense, is kind of like putting the white flag up. Is it the white flag at a race car thing where everyone catches up to you and you lose the asymmetric advantage which you've worked so hard to obtain? I don't think that's going to happen. I strongly encourage those who can deal with the jus ad bellum arguments, issues, the pacifists, to continue to work to try and find a way about ending warfare, period. But if I'm cynical, that's where I have to register my vote. So my concern is that if that problem can't be solved, how can we ensure that we protect the lives of innocent non-combatants in the most appropriate way?
Thank you, Ron. Rob, I would like to give you the opportunity to react to that, and it would be especially nice, I think, if you could focus on 2 points. The first one that Ron was making with regard to the right of not to be killed by a LARs, and the question what that would mean with regard to being killed by a cruise missile or by an artillery shell or whatever. So that would be, I think, the first point that I think would be important to discuss further. And the second would be the question, what kind of ethical capacity do we really need? And that was Ron's argument, the question that basically the laws of wars are sufficient for ethical behavior on the battlefield. So these, I think, would be the 2 points in which I would be especially interested in.
Okay.
But you can also talk about the other ones, so that's not exclusive.
Yeah, so, I mean, one thing to keep in mind here is how difficult it is for good intentions to come to fruition in the area of technology development. That the ways in which technologies are taken up and used and technological trajectories are not easy to determine. They're not easy to fine-tune. And so while I accept that Ron's motivations here are virtuous, I accept that he doesn't see himself as kind of a champion of the military-industrial complex with tremendous enthusiasm, when we look at the real world, the more people invest in war, the more likely war is. The more these technologies are developed by the US, the more that drives competitors. And a moratorium may simply not be enough to try to interrupt that process. So yes, there is a question here about our attitude towards military research spending in general, but I don't think you need to be a pacifist to be hesitant about this kind of full steam ahead, we've got to get there first approach that Ron is essentially an advocate for. Now, looking at what makes a weapon evil in itself, within just war theory, there's a category of evil means. Why is it that we think that chemical weapons, why is it that we think that landmines are particularly problematic? Landmines blow you up, hand grenades blow you up. What is it about the landmine that makes it an evil means? There's an argument that can be made that landmines are very poor at discrimination, given their history over the life cycle of the weapon. But of course, when that argument was made, when that argument about inability to discriminate was made about chemical weapons, military advocates of these systems were very quick to argue, actually, you can use landmines in ways that seem quite discriminating. You can fence off and label the minefield. You can only be prepared to use chemical weapons in areas where there's high troop concentrations and you know what the wind speed is, etc. Over the course of the history of warfare, human beings have set various limits and said these are not means that we are willing to embrace, that they seem to be disrespectful of the humanity of both combatants and non-combatants. And what I'm suggesting is that that the strong popular response to the prospect of killer robots reflects a deep-seated sense that human life is worth more than a decision made by an autonomous weapon. Now, it's simply a mistake to say the person is killed by, the Hellfire missile, they're not killed by the robot. Because remember, we are insisting that it's the robot that's making the decision. The person who pushes the go button to launch the future killer robot is not launching a Hellfire missile. They're launching a robotic weapon, and that means, I'm suggesting, should be prohibited. Now, I think this is a developing sort of intuitive landscape. I think there is room for argument here, but I want to hold that part of what it is to respect the humanity of even our enemy is to insist that a human being should not just be supervising, should not just be programming the weapon, but should actually consider the value of that person's life when they kill them. And in the absence of that, the weapon is unethical. Now, sorry, Michael, you might have to remind me of the second point you wanted me to address.
The second point was with regard to the question. I mean, you were saying that one of the criticism is that a LAR will never be able to accomplish the kind of ethical reasoning that we as humans are able to accomplish, while Ron is arguing that this is simply not necessary. So it is completely sufficient to have algorithms that represent the laws of war. And these are basically much more simple than a high complex ethical reasoning. So the question is, what do we really need when it comes to a robot?
All right. I think there might be very, very few circumstances where it might be possible to task a weapon in such a way that some clearly defined rules would eliminate the possibility of an attack on non-combatants. Perhaps suppression of enemy air defences, perhaps naval warfare in a discrete geographical area. But even in that context, we need to be able to determine when when the enemy has surrendered. We need to be able to determine when they are no longer effective participants in the combat and cease to be legitimate targets on that basis. And then I think one does require a capacity to reason at a very abstract and high level. But again, I just want to express my belief that I'm glad that Ron has conceded these shouldn't be described as ethical robots. And certainly that has been, if not Ron's own words, that certainly has been the media take-up of Ron's work, is to describe it as a project of building ethical robots. And we should all be very clear. The claim is that it might be possible to build robots that kill fewer non-combatants. And then there's this further question, is that enough to make the weapon ethical? And there's well understood problems with consequentialist reasoning in the context of warfare. If all we care about is reducing the number of innocent civilian lives, perhaps our policy should be to threaten to firebomb the kindergartens in which the enemy leaders have their children. We should say, if you mess with us, we will burn your children alive. And the consequence of that policy might actually be to reduce civilian deaths. But that's a profoundly unethical policy in the context of just war theory. So it's not enough simply to say this weapon reduces the casualty count. We must be looking at it as a means. We must be looking at the deontological aspects of just war theory.
Thank you very much, Rob. I think that Ron completely accepts that. I mean, he was hinting at the deontological argument, so I guess he would not allow killing children for utilitarian considerations. But I would like to go back to Ron with the question that you raised, and that is indeed something we should discuss further, and that is the question whether it is indeed disrespectful being killed by a machine. I mean, I guess you are right, Rob, when you're emphasizing that even if you're killed by a cruise missile or by a bullet, there's still somebody responsible whom you are facing directly, and that is not the case if you're killed by a machine. So that is the question that I would like to ask Ron here. What do you think about this argument that it's disrespectful being killed by a machine?
I don't accept it. The real question it degenerates to, from my point of view, is initially you have hand-to-hand combat. Then you have a spear. How long does a spear have to be before it becomes disrespectful? Does it have to be so the spear is over the hill and you can't see them? This is really what we're contending with in this particular case. I want to get back to the benefits, potential benefits of using this technology, again with respect to non-combatants. The notion of human warfighters may take, under fear, under emotional stress, under duress, may take a strategy of shooting first and asking questions later, whereas these systems can act far more conservatively and assume risk on behalf of the non-combatants, take a more first do no harm. Let's talk about the Hellfire missile. What if we could make that Hellfire missile just a little bit smarter, and we put a school bus detector on it when it's been launched, and the pilot has launched it at this particular target, but it detects a school bus, and it says, I'm not going to explode. Is that a system that makes a decision whether to engage a target? Is that an unacceptable and unethical decision? That's what basically the governor does in the work that I've described. It applies constraints. It applies, in specific contexts, certain rules. It won't cover the entire space, but if you could make it just step by step a little bit safer than existing technology, wouldn't that potentially be a win? And let me also ask you this. I mean, the burning thing, I mean, that's total war, and that is unacceptable in so many ways in terms of violating the fundamental principles of just war and humanity and the like. But what if we could design these systems that, grant me this, if we could satisfy the conditions of proportionality, if we could, in limited circumstances, do better than human warfighters with respect to discrimination, if we could continue to use our weapons with respect to humanity, in other words, use the right proportionality and the right weapons and not create superfluous injury, which is why blinding lasers, in the approach that Human Rights Watch and ICRAC is pursuing as a codicil to the the CCW conventions of the Geneva Conventions as the basis for a ban. But suppose we could do that. That boils down to your fundamental question again, that a human being has the right to be killed by a human being. I contend that these systems, which whether they be artillery shells or whatever, suffer from the same fallacy or from the same concerns that you're expressing. They are no different. These are not agents that make decisions on their own. They are agents that make decisions that human beings have told them to make. They do it in context, just as they have done in a variety of different sets of circumstances when I get on the train to go to Hartsfield. And when you're not here, but if you do that at the Atlanta airport, there's nobody driving. But it gets me there probably safer than a human being would, because he's not texting or on the telephone at that point in time, and it does it far more reliably and far more safely, I would say quantitatively, than a human being could. Could we, and if we were able to adhere, and I agree with you, it's not an easy problem, but I think where we differ, at least with some of your colleagues, some of you just argue that it's an unsolvable problem. I don't really believe that's the case. I believe a really challenging problem is to replicate full-level human moral reasoning, but because we're enforcing the morality that has been developed by humans and not asking the robot to go through the processes to do that by using forms of deontic logic, it becomes straightforward, relatively speaking, to be able to do that. To do it only if we can show it do it better than humans. I'm not arguing this should be a big experiment. We send robots out there and they learn what to do. We don't do that with human warfighters. How do we teach our human warfighters? We tell them what the laws of war are, and then we give them a gun, and then they go out, hopefully, to adhere to that. Well, we should do the very same thing for these particular platforms. And the whole notion of narrow sets of circumstances and avoiding the typical issues, the narrow issues which philosophers, among others, will address, which are these ethical quandaries which are often outside the norm, and remembering that the system is not allowed to fire unless it has sufficient certainty in discrimination, in proportionality, and basically it is a restraint. It is a muzzle on these systems, is what I argue for. So with that, I'll let Michael introduce your comments.
Yes, that's what I want to do, Rob. I would like to give you an opportunity because, I mean, Ron's argument is basically that the LARs is only extending the distance between the responsible human being and the victim, but there is still a responsible human being at the end. What do you say about that?
So this is precisely why I warned about the slippery nature of the concept of autonomy. I mean, we started out by saying autonomous weapons are weapons where the machine decides which targets to engage and when. And now I'm hearing that, in fact, it's always a human being who decides. And that this seems to me an important point. If you want to advertise...
I would like to advertise the weapon. That's very important, yeah.
Well, let me quickly comment on that. The discrimination capability, the target designation, the particular signature that is being looked for, is determined by a human being. And the system is basically doing an analysis of the incoming sensory data, matching it against what the human told it to do, and that's the target selection process. But the human has specified the criteria for targeting. The system identifies it in the field.
Yes, I don't think that's enough to count as an explanation to the kind of grieving relatives of the victims of these completely hypothetical weapon systems, let me add. And I guess, you know, in the background here, I want to continue to insist that moving forward into this very dangerous technology with some fairly obvious social and political consequences on the basis of these kind of thought experiments about what if we could do this, this, and this, you know, we should be very cautious about embracing a technology when we simply haven't got anything near that. But again, the grieving relative of the child that's been killed by the robot is supposed to be reassured by the fact that somewhere down the line someone launched the weapon. There seems to me the possibility of a kind of a break in the chain of agency. Now, maybe it is possible to describe some systems with a minimal level of target recognition in them as merely transmitting the intention of the commanding officer. Even in that circumstance, I'm inclined to say that we're coming up against this intuition, and it is just an intuition, and we'll have to see how widely it is shared, that human beings deserve more than this kind of, you know, state change in a machine when their life's at stake.
Thank you.
I agree with you. We should not proceed full speed ahead. That's why I support a moratorium. If you remember that, that's an important distinction. I am not saying these systems are ready for prime time by any stretch of the imagination. What I'm saying is they potentially could do better, and applying a ban to the development or the research into this particular technology, to me, to be candid and to be blunt, leaves blood on the floor. If we are allowing non-combatants to die when we could potentially be protecting them until it's shown that they can't. And I know the responsibility is we have to show that they can, but I'm saying don't field these systems until we can demonstrate that they comply adequately with the laws of war and outperform human warfighters with respect to ethical performance. Regarding the traditional NGO approach of invoking grieving relatives and sad pictures and the like as well too, the pathos arguments that you did, to me, is there a responsibility chain from a high-altitude bomb? Is there a responsibility chain from a cruise missile? Who are they going to go grieving to in that particular case? Even an artillery shell, again, as well, too. To me, the net effect is it's just a tool which can potentially do better than existing warfighters can. The military is concerned with this, of course, because if we went forward with this, which I have no idea if they will or not, you have to demonstrate that there is little or no mission erosion. I mean, the easiest way not to ensure ethical performance is, well, the first time I gave a talk in front of a bunch of pacifists, well, a truly ethical robot would throw down its gun, and it would refuse to fire under any and all circumstances. Maybe at one point of view, certainly from a Kantian perspective, I would agree that that's a fair characterization. But we also have to live to some extent with the underlying realities and the underlying situation that we find ourselves in. Confronted with conflict, you seem to indicate we are more secure. Well, in some ways we are, and in some ways we are not. Whether we should be investing as much money into defense as we are, that's a good debatable point, but that's not the point of this particular debate. So I think we have to be concerned, again, about how we do move forward, hence the need for a moratorium. And I think we need to do this not out of pathos, but more from a rational discussion of satisfying existing international humanitarian law, identifying any gaps that exist in international humanitarian law, coming up with definitions for what lethal autonomous robots or what killer robots are, which are acceptable, which are not acceptable, and under what conditions they are acceptable or not acceptable. Calling for an outright ban, I don't even know exactly what's being called for in being banned. And I've had people at Human Rights Watch tell me they want me to help them come up with that definition. Well, we can, but let's have a moratorium. A moratorium, an outright ban, pushes people away from the table to begin with. I mean, we haven't signed treaties already, the United States. There's 77 conventions we haven't signed. We haven't signed yet the Ottawa Accords banning landmines. Neither has China, neither has Russia. We're becoming closer from what I understand, but these things keep people away. Now, we do adhere to that, although we do have landmines in the demilitarized zone in Korea, the only place that we currently use those. And there's some interesting questions about the appropriate use of robotics technology in that environment, which is an active war zone. There is a line which says that if you step over this line, you can be shot, and it is perfectly legal to do so if you happen to be a combatant. But actually, the civilians have all been warned to not go in there and cross that line. So, and keep in mind again the notion of the principle of double effect in this case. It's unfortunate that killing civilians is not always a war crime. It's not always a war crime, even if it's foreseen. The principle of double effect, and this is not so much for you, Rob, but for our audience, argues that there is a necessary good and an associated evil with that. And this dates back to the Middle Ages. And if the achieved military good outweighs the associated evil, which is the death of non-combatants, even if it's foreseen, it is excusable by international law. Now, whether you agree with that or not is a question of whether you accept just war theory or not. And there are those, many people, especially in the human rights community, who argue that just war theory is not an acceptable basis for conducting warfare. So there's all these different issues associated with that. But getting back to my primary point, which I'll close with, is that I feel still that we have a moral responsibility to those people who are unfortunately, and in many cases unjustifiably, trapped within the battle space. These systems should not be used in counterinsurgencies. I've often said that. They should be used in interstate warfare to reduce the likelihood of civilian casualties in these cases. But in any case, can we do better using these systems? I believe we can. It is a partial thought experiment because we created a prototype, but I can't guarantee that we can. But I don't want to throw this out until it is shown. For whatever reason, it is impossible. But I still remain optimistic and not cynical about it.
Rob, I would like to give you an opportunity to react to that, and then I might shift to something else, please.
Okay. I mean, again, it does seem to me that there's this ambiguity in Ron's perspective about whether the machine is deciding whether it's an autonomous weapon, as you described it in the introduction, or whether a human being is just using a very long spear. It is clear that in the context of a high-altitude bomb or a cruise missile, we can identify the person who decided that target should be attacked. Someone fired the weapon, someone instructed them to do so. We can maintain a chain of responsibility. That does become, it seems to me, more and more problematic the more autonomy we hand over to the weapons. And it seems to me that that sometimes Ron wants to say, look at this wonderful new machine I'm going to be able to invent. It's going to do all the hard work of deciding who can and can't be killed. And then when pushed on that, he retreats to the idea that, no, this is just a very long spear. Now, obviously, Ron and I aren't necessarily going to agree on that. So perhaps that's for the judgment of the audience to look at the way in which the notion of autonomy is being used here. Again, there's a kind of big picture, well, there's two big picture philosophical issues in the background here. How should we proceed sort of politically? How should we proceed with an opportunity to regulate some future technological trajectory? Should we be distracted by this very hypothetical possibility that we could do better? Or should we allow some reasonable concerns about what a world looks like in which major powers are armed with long-range, loitering, autonomous weapon systems? Is that a world that we think it's really likely that that's going to be a better world for non-combatants, or indeed for anyone? Is that the world we want, or should we sort of make our decisions on the basis of this kind of possibility that that might be a better world should a very kind of ambitious research program come to term. Now, there is this kind of question about a ban versus a moratorium. My intuition is that if we can get a workable moratorium, we should consolidate it. We should try to move towards a ban, because that would enshrine what I think is this important deontological consideration, and also reduce the chances of moving into a world that I think is pretty unattractive. Again, let me highlight this question. Is it enough to say of the person who only kills 2 civilians for every enemy soldier that they kill, to give that person a medal for their ethics because their comrades are killing 3 civilians? That seems to me the sort of deep at the heart of Ron's case, that these are better weapons, that it misses the fact that when it comes to an innocent human life, to a non-combatant life, and indeed to any human life, that we should expect ethical perfection from human beings. We should expect it knowing that they will, knowing that in many circumstances they will fail. But to go into combat with a machine that we know is going to kill this many civilians and say, look, that's fantastic because it's not as bad as the other people who are fighting on the battlefield, that seems to miss some deontological constraints at the heart of just war theory.
Thank you very much, Rob. We only have a few minutes and then we open up the floor for a broader debate. But before we go to this, I would like to ask the both of you to reflect on the following question. Let us assume we decide on a moratorium. I would like to ask you what you think would be the ideas that should be discussed in the time of a moratorium. Ron, you were mentioning that it would be necessary to close gaps in international humanitarian law, and I would like to ask you, for example, what kind of gaps you have in mind. But in general, the question is, what would be necessary to accomplish if there would be a decision for a moratorium?
Okay. One quick thing, I just have to say, feel free to ask the civilian who was spared in that particular case, if it was 2 versus 3, as to whether their rights were respected or not. And also, speaking to your question, there are several different things that could be. I didn't say there exist gaps. I said, do gaps possibly exist that this technology doesn't cover? That's part of the discussion. You are convinced, and your organizations are convinced, that there are gaps. There are others, including many people in the legal community, where there is a debate going on in Geneva with Peter Asaro and Matthew Waxman, who believe that existing international humanitarian law, which requires proportionality, which requires discrimination, which requires military necessity, which requires humanity, all to be respected, or that system cannot be deployed, period. If the system it can't even be developed. If that system doesn't satisfy those criteria, it is banned already by definition. So are there existing gaps that require the kinds of codicils that you folks argue? And that really speaks to the question of definitional, okay? What do we mean? What killer robots are we talking about? And finally, the one thing that we haven't spoken of, which I know you're familiar with, is the Martin's Clause. The issue is, the Martin's Clause is something that exists in international humanitarian law from the very beginning, which says basically if this weapon system violates the dictates of the public conscience, it can be banned with no other further consideration. In other words, if it's so utterly revolting, as you say, to be potentially killed, it's such a violation of human dignity and rights, and everyone or a significant percentage feel that way, then it can be banned. And if that's the case, okay. I am not arguing, I said I'm not averse to a ban. I just believe that we can do better. And I don't want to leave this opportunity where the decision-making is constantly being pushed towards the so-called tip of the spear due to the rapid tempo of modern warfare as compared to what it was 20 years ago, 50 years ago, certainly 100 and 200 years ago, where more rational thinking could be brought to bear. Right now you have sea-skimming supersonic missiles coming in. Human beings can't make these decisions. A Patriot missile battery, which has a human in the loop, so to speak, at the end. When that picks a target, automatically it selects a target, a red light comes on. An operator has 9 seconds to push a button to say, don't fire. How can they possibly make an informed decision? And isn't that person just being set up as a fall guy when that tornado is being shot down? Or they push the button and the missile goes through and kills a appropriate civilians or a military target and the like as well too. Having a human in the loop isn't necessarily the right answer. The issue is having a meaningful decision-making process where you have time, such as one could argue, although we're not getting there, with the Predator and others, where you have more eyes on target. You may have legal counsel to be able to do that under those sets of circumstances, have a more informed decision-making. And I'm not talking about extrajudicial action. I'm not justifying that. I'm talking about the use of the technology to potentially leverage greater human moral reasoning under that set of circumstances. Under those cases where there's more time, we should take the time. But if you have the North Korean army crossing the DMZ in force, breaching the minefields, do you think perhaps that under that full-up condition of war where there are no civilians present, that what a typical military tactic would be applying crossfire to that to slow down the advance, which would buy perhaps minutes of time, which would be enough to potentially rally a defense and win the war, if you want to use that phraseology in this case. I contend that there are cases where this technology has applicability, and part of the use of the moratorium would be to identify those sets of circumstances.
Thank you, Ron. Yeah, Rob, either answering directly to Rob's considerations, but also with regard to the moratorium, what do you think should be achieved in the time of a moratorium?
Well, look, I think one of the things that's interesting here is that Ron and other advocates for these systems, I mean, Ron's just said he's not an advocate for this system, but for these systems, but you know, he's advertising their potential advantages repeatedly in the context of this discussion. What they identify is what they claim are very strong dynamics leading to the deployment of fully autonomous weapons. I mean, this argument about human supervision, the same arguments that about the virtues of autonomy, that, you know, if the enemy destroys the satellite links, the weapon doesn't drop out of the sky, that the time for the decision making is very short. All of those arguments suggest that human supervision is just a red herring here. Once the weapons are capable of operating effectively without without direct human supervision, that's the way they'll be used. People won't be weakening the functioning of their multi-million-dollar weapons system because they want someone to press one of these red buttons in the background. So, you know, if it's true that there are all these sort of, you know, dynamics pushing towards autonomy, and I'm struck here by when I first started writing about killer robots, I actually had an email exchange with the then director of the Future Combat Systems project, and he said, look, I want to assure you that none of these systems will ever be used without a human being in the loop. And now huge swathes of the US military essentially arguing that it's inevitable that human beings will be taken out of the loop. And that's in 5 years. That's in 5 years of debate. If there's all this kind of momentum, I don't think a moratorium is enough. I think that if we really wanted, even if we thought that we would fail, a ban would be a more effective moratorium than a moratorium. That is essentially, seems to me, its function in the debate is to diffuse the calls for a ban. You know, it's the kind of reasonable middle position. And let me remind you, the middle position is not always correct. You know, think about the early debates about, about equality and suffrage. You know, the feminists are arguing that women are the moral equals of men. The conservatives are arguing that women are incapable of kind of political participation. The middle ground is, give them 2/3 of the vote. You know, that's not the right position. Okay, the middle position is not always the correct line to take. So it seems to me that the function of the call for a moratorium is simply to sort of take the wind out of the sails of a campaign for a ban, and then allow people to prototype their systems to the point where the pressure within military circles to deploy them is so strong that the possibility of a ban is lost. So ban versus moratorium for me is partially a political consideration. It's partially about if we want to try to avert a very dangerous world, and again, the debate here is not just about the kind of the details of the individual weapon system in the circumstances which it's going to be used. It's what is a world going to look like when major strategic military forces are armed to the teeth with autonomous weapons. If we want to try to avoid that, or even if we just want to try to push it out 20, 25 years, what we need is a ban. That a moratorium is simply a way of taking the urgency out of the question until people can develop their robots.
Thank you very much, Rob. So I would like to ask now Ron and then you, Rob, again, to summarize in 2 minutes shortly of your position again for the audience. And I would like to remind all of us that after these final statements, we will open up the floor for a debate. Those of you who are in the room, I would like to ask you to press the red button as long as you speak. And those who are watching the stream online, there's an icon, question and answer, on the right side of your screen. You have to click on that and submit your question electronically. We will then read the question when it arrives here. So that is just to remind you of the procedures for the discussion. But now let me ask Ron and then Rob for your final statement before you go to the question and answer session.
Okay. Just a couple of quick things, really quick things. One, I don't agree with all your facts regarding the deployment of DoD robotics in 5 years. Again, we have a moratorium in place for the development and deployment of these systems, so prototypes are not going to be built for the kinds of systems you fear the most in that particular case. So that's I just wanted to put that on the table. Regarding my summary position, it's what I said basically at the beginning. I feel that there is a moral responsibility that is currently unaddressed in the battle space. Civilians are being slaughtered at, in many cases, unprecedented rates due to modern technology. And then the question becomes, from my point of view, what can we as scientists and technologists do to reduce the loss of innocent life and destruction of civilian property, assuming wars will continue? And I also didn't mention, but there is an assumption also that lethal autonomy is inevitable, largely because it already exists in a variety of different forms. So if that is the case, except if there's an international ban, I will say that as well too. That way you could potentially stop it if we could define what it is that we're banning, which I think is an important thing to do. We need to protect non-combatants using technology. And I would urge the opponents of this technology to come up with solutions to that particular problem. How can we use technology to more effectively protect human life, innocent human life, within the battlefield? If it's not this, what is it? How can we get it adapted? Why can't we regulate these killing systems in ways that they more effectively comply with international humanitarian law and result in what Walzer would call the principle of double intentions, where we actively try and reduce civilian casualties rather than merely tolerate it according to the principle of double effect. That's what I think is a worthwhile effort. I haven't seen any arguments that indicate that it is not worth or impossible to study, and I would encourage my research community to actively consider this, not just winning wars, but winning wars more in compliance with the laws of war.
Thank you, Ron. Rob, yes, please.
Yes, I think I can summarize my position as to say I think that lethal autonomous robots are unlikely to realize Ron's admirable goals. I think that they are both unlikely to be capable of the sorts of discriminations that would be necessary to reduce civilian or non-combatant casualties, but also that, as we've seen with the drones, what looks in one context like a more discriminating weapon system has actually established the conditions for its own use. That, drones are being used more and more often with the result that there are high civilian casualty numbers, precisely because there's this promise, it's better than carpet bombing. But the US wouldn't be carpet bombing Afghanistan. It wouldn't be carpet bombing Pakistan or Yemen to kill individuals. So it's a false promise that you're going to get lower civilian casualties from this kind of technical solution. I think the weapons are unethical because of my concerns about responsibility and because of my concerns about the dignity of human beings and the requirement that some human being somewhere takes a pause to consider whether that person should die or not. And I guess most fundamentally, I think these weapon systems are dangerous and destabilizing. And for very orthodox arms control reasons about trying to reduce the chance of accidental war and reduce the incentives for going to war that exist within the international system, we should be working to ban lethal autonomous robots.
Thank you very much, Rob. Now let me open up the floor for questions. Please be reminded you have to push the red button, and anybody watching online, please send us your question.
What I find hard to understand is how is this going to help the ability to differentiate between combatants and non-combatants? That's usually not in the attacker's ability. Think about the people, in the Middle East, where they're using human shields. That's exactly what they are doing. They are mixing civilians to make it harder for people to make the decision to fire on them. And that is going to continue. That's part of the culture of those places. And there's nothing we can do with no matter what kind of weapon, in my view, to really get to that differentiation. I don't know that drones do it. I don't know that these LARs would be able to do it anyway.
Ron, would you like to answer?
Sure. It's an interesting point, and keep in mind again, I said we should not be looking at the application of these systems in existing warfare scenarios, which are counterinsurgency operations where there are high percentages of civilians, which will do those sorts of things. And also remember, humans don't always respect those rights as well too, and quite often civilians get killed under similar sets of circumstances. I argue that they should be used in interstate warfare, and developed initially in that case, in very narrow circumstances, such as building clearing operations, such as counter-sniper operations, not for any arbitrary mission that you can conceive of, but designed for very specific purposes to augment and effectively go through. If you're clearing a building, that's one of the most dangerous jobs that a human warfighter has to do. And what happened in Haditha and other places, according to one version of the story, is that the soldiers cracked the doors open, rolled grenades through, and didn't assume risk on behalf of the combatant, because if there was a guy inside there with a gun, they would have been dead. So can we introduce robots, or even throwbots as they're called as well too, which could potentially wait until they are fired upon if you introduce them in pairs? Return fire with fire is a legitimate tactic, where they have increased certainty that you don't have to fire just because you believe at some level that that's a potential hostile. You can actually go up much closer with the robot, assume far more risk than any human being in their right mind would ever possibly do, and indeed maybe even disarm an individual if needs be under these cases. The tactics will be fundamentally different than human tactics in this case. And if they are used correctly, if they are used appropriately, not as human warfighters are currently fighting, I do believe that they potentially can, by having a sufficiently high threshold for certainty, and the legitimate use of force now is justified under the exhibition of hostility or hostile intent. Hostile intent is harder. Hostility, which is basically shooting at you or something along those lines, is much easier to exhibit in that case. So, like I said, not shoot first, ask questions later. First, do no harm. If you're not sure, you don't shoot. It's as simple as that from an algorithmic perspective. Now, you will argue there may be questions in terms of being able to preserve the hardware. There's cost associated with these things, and they may be not used in that particular set of circumstances. But in principle, that's what should be done. And these systems should have enough intelligence, I would contend, to understand the situation they're in and refuse to operate in circumstances that are outside their bounds.
Rob, would you like to add something to the question, or should we go to the next question?
Again, I just observed that the amount of intelligence that Ron has attributed to these systems actually looks to me quite extraordinary there. That's a very high that's a very high threshold. And again, yes, just to observe that it's one thing to say in principle a weapon system could be used in this way. It's another thing to have a realistic assessment. If you've just, you've only got a dozen of these things, they represent, $200 million worth of equipment each. The idea that they're going to be used in this very kind of risk-sensitive, casualty-averse fashion, that seems to me a fantasy. I think a realistic understanding of what this technology is likely to be used for in practice suggests that these kind of hypotheticals that Ron's developing about how they might be used is wishful thinking.
Let me respond to that just quickly. These systems do exist right now. The shot spotter system for counter-sniper operations, which can be placed in an open area, which will instantaneously, quasi-instantaneously, slew a weapon system, put it on target when it sees a muzzle flash and gets a report from that, can potentially engage a target directly at that point in time. Right now, those systems require human confirmation through the propagation of what's called a video chip, which comes back to either their not laptop, but their iPad, I guess it would be, or something on their wrist. The human being has one of two choices at that point in time. One is they can, without due diligence, push the button to fire, assuming it's safe, or two, take the time to identify that particular target, and by that time the sniper is gone. So the real question is there an impetus to moving this decision-making towards that target? I would contend that we can potentially detect the consequences of line of fire by moving through this and understanding what's to the left, what's to the right. Fighter pilots have done this already in Bosnia and other places where they deliberately changed their route, knowing that if they went this way, there was a school behind it, so they took personal risk upon themselves to change their route for a bombing run to minimize the likelihood of disaster. This kind of knowledge could be available to a robotic platform, which might not be available to a warfighter. So I'm saying there are systems that just take a little bit more to get to that particular point. And the trouble is the existing systems that put the blame on the warfighter when they do whack-a-mole, basically, on that particular thing, leads to potential calamity.
Thank you. We have two questions coming in from the stream. Caroline, would you read those, please, and push the button?
Yep. Okay. So we'll just ask one and then go to the second. This question is for Ron, addressing one of the issues that Rob brought up. So earlier in the exchange, you argued that LARs are just like other weapons and that a human is ultimately accountable for the decision to kill. Later, though, you argue that LARs are superior to other weapons precisely in that they take humans out of the loop. So how do you reconcile these two claims, which seem...
I have never said that they take them out of the loop. A human is always in the loop. There's a different notion of what it means. This whole business of a human being in the loop is a complete red herring. It's an issue of at what level is the human in the loop. At this point, these systems become under supervisory control. You are tasking, a human is in a loop with an average warfighter as well, too. The commander tells them to carry out this particular mission, and they carry out this particular mission. They have the ability to do certain things that they have been instructed to do and carry out the mission to the best of their training and capabilities. The same sort of thing holds here. There is never, ever a human out of the loop. You're talking Cylons if you're talking that stuff. Those are independent species that are created, which is, talk about fantasy, that's real fantasy in this case, or Terminators or what you like. That's not what these systems are. These systems are extensions of human morality encoded, could be extensions of human morality, which will be encoded in here to engage targets as human beings have specified they should engage those particular targets. Whether they do it well or not is an open question. They should not be deployed until they can do it not only well, but better than human beings in my case. And we need to have further discussions before we call for the ban, in my estimation.
Rob, would you like to say something about that, or should we go to the next question?
I just think Ron's definition of in the loop there is a very expansive one. I think the fact that a human being has programmed it or has given the go order is not enough when people are concerned about having a human being in the loop. Obviously, these things haven't just sprung into existence sort of, without human without human agency. But if there's not a human being sort of considering whether that person should live or die or not, there's not a human being in the loop.
Let's go to the second question, please.
This is actually a good follow-up. How do we decide, and most importantly, who decides what ethical values and moral conditions should be programmed into these weapons? So how do you get that extension? And how can these then be guaranteed to be present?
That comes from JAG lawyers. Again, the people who write the rules of engagement. If this ever goes forward, that would have to be a new division, a new capability written into the military to be able to transform the laws of war and the rules of engagement into a machine acceptable and understandable form. This is not for roboticists to decide. This is not for philosophers to decide if that's the case, if these systems move forward. The philosophers should decide the premises for international humanitarian law. The lawyers develop international humanitarian law, and military lawyers are the ones that deal with the implementation of that as well, too, just as they develop the rules of engagement for warfighters as well, too. So basically, it's just finding a way to be able to assist them in making these in a machine acceptable form.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Then I would like to thank you all for participating in this debate. I would like to thank especially Rob Sparrow in Australia for joining in online, and also Ron Arkin for sitting here and participating in the debate. I would like to remind you that there's a survey which is both online, if you watch the stream, but also on your table. It would be nice to get your feedback on this debate. And if you would like to continue the debate and deliberation, there are argument maps in agora.gartech.edu. That is a place where the debate will continue for the time being. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Rob.